if you're not growing, you're dying. Lou Holtz said that. I say it all the time. She said, if you're not growing, you're dead. That it's the same thing. You're empty. Growth is a natural progression, and you want to continue to grow. And purpose comes from learning. Purpose comes from growth. Purpose comes from exploration and failure. As we hit the 1-year mark of our podcast, The High Performance Life, I wanted to take a few minutes and share with you some of the best lessons, the best conversations, and the takeaways that I've learned and gleaned from the last year. So I've had the privilege of interviewing over 50 of extremely high performers in all kinds of industries, from relationships and love to impact to faith to energy, you name it. We have touched on some of the best guests. And here's a couple of my favorite ones. I'll start with Chris Ullman. Chris was a great interview, and it was the timing of the interview and the conversation that really made it so special. I was at a college visit for my son, having a conversation about the time of our lives and what he was doing in the time of his life. And he wrote a book called 4 Billionaires and a Parking Attendant. And the beauty of that book is obviously we get lessons from everyone around us, and sometimes they're not from where you think. But the other part of that conversation that really stood out to me was the fact that Chris was actually investing in his children in a different and unique way. He was actually working with the university that his son was attending. He was doing some classwork and some on-campus stuff for them. And he was leveraging his skill and his background to pour into the university that his son was going to, which is only connecting him and his children in a closer level. And so I really found that as a father, as a husband, as somebody that wants to continue to intertwine my life with my family where it can, and I don't mean too much, but enough. I really found it super interesting to listen to Chris, to learn from Chris, and to be at that stage of my life at this visit, doing it on the road and having that conversation. Another great conversation was Nick Lavery. Now, Nick is an absolute badass. Special Forces, Green Beret, has the loss of a leg in war and ends up getting a prosthetic and going back after earning Purple Hearts and every award that you can imagine. But we talked about life, and we didn't just talk about war. We glossed over war, and it was a great conversation. But we talked about what he had to go through to get to that next level, the purpose that he had to have. You talk about impact that he was making to the people that he loved, but mainly something bigger than himself. And he talked about his belief in something bigger than himself, his faith in God, and the ability to actually get through something with purpose, knowing that he was there to not only serve something bigger than himself, but serving all of his brothers, serving everybody that he was actually there to serve with. And I found it so uplifting. I mean, we even had some great conversations about how you could be calm in war and not in the Dunkin' Donuts line. So when I think about this conversation with Nick Lavery, what really stood out to me was his sense of purpose. He really struggled to get through this. I mean, obviously losing a limb, losing multiple brothers in war, going through what he went through and almost not even making it, but to actually drive deeper into purpose, deeper into something bigger than himself. It was a great lesson and a great reminder to me and to everybody how important it is to just make sure that we have a purpose bigger than ourselves. You know, I have a big why, and I have something that I've always worked towards, and I believe in God and I believe in a bigger purpose. But listening to someone who lost so much in war, really dive into the things that help them get through it, it really just resonated heavily with me. And I found that to be very, very uplifting, and also just a sweet reminder to me that no matter how hard life can be, you know, there's something bigger out there than us. And that particular day, I remember having a very difficult time getting to the actual interview. I backed into my garage door. I was re-putting it on the hinge. Like, it was a whole ordeal. And when you think about it, I actually came into that interview where I had this level of peace because I thought of what Nick had gone through. I thought about his story. I thought about all I had read about. And so when he started talking about purpose, it was even more powerful. there was a conversation with Larry Hagner all about fatherhood and the dad life, and just being a dad in general is such an honor and such a fun topic to talk about and full of failure. But Larry and I talked about something where, in the beginning of a conversation, you're kind of trying to find that vibe, and it's, I'm a dad, you're a dad, and men sometimes start off a little tight. And there was a point in the story where we both just opened up. And it was really interesting because I shared with Larry what I had seen as my boys grew up. And I told the story of the shoes. And in my house, we're not supposed to put our shoes in a particular spot, according to my wife. And I've been doing it forever. And year after year, my boys would copy me. And as I rushed through life, wasting time in whatever I was doing, I often would forget something and have to back up and come back in and grab it. And often when I did, I would pause in the same spot and look down. And when I'd look down, I'd see those shoes, and I would see my 6-year-old son, my 3-year-old son's shoes, and my shoes all in the same spot. And there are really a couple of big takeaways from that Larry and I had a great conversation about. And number one is how fast time goes. Time goes so fast that as I watched their shoes grow, today, one pair of shoes is a size 12, and it's almost 2 sizes bigger than me. And then the other size is just 1 size below me at this point in time. And as my boys grow into manhood, it's a great reminder that time moves so fast. And we really had a connection over that talk and that conversation. The second part to that is the slow down. It's a great reminder to all of us, and especially me, to just slow down. When you slow down, you get to see the world in a different way. And we got to explore that topic and really talk through it. And I still think about telling that story. And I've told that story multiple times on the podcast, but it's one I will never forget the rest of my life. Another great conversation was Jamie Gruber. Jamie and I were like two guys who had been long lost brothers. We are both bald, but that's not the reason. We are both guys that just really, really hit it off from the second we started. I mean, I had to hit record quick because we were already going into a deep, awesome conversation. The biggest takeaway from that conversation was Jamie decided to pack up and move his entire family to the Dominican Republic. And he quit his corporate job, and he was making a good 6-figure income. And he just, in a lot of ways, as people would say here in the US, he threw it all away to go and live on an island. And it was really an interesting dynamic to understand what that must have felt like. But there's a bigger takeaway. And the biggest takeaway was how important his support was from his spouse and his family. His kids just did it, and he said they loved it and they were excited. But even more interesting to me, and something we really dove deep into, was his supportive spouse. He said from the get-go, she was just on board. She immediately said, I'm in. I'm going to follow you wherever, but I trust you. It wasn't about the money. It was about loving each other and going on an adventure together. And I love that part of the story. And I will always remember those types of stories because they resonate with what I believe, what my principles are, what my values are. With or without money, when you have each other, you're not alone. And it's a really great takeaway. Then there's Andrew Thorpe King. And Andrew was a very special guest in the sense that in one conversation, I made a lifelong friend. And you have to remember that in life, that one conversation, one connection can completely change something. Andrew's one of those guys that the minute I had him on the show, first of all, his book about failure and all of his stories were amazing, and he was so easy to talk to. But even after that, we've communicated multiple times after the show. We've both pushed stuff out for each other on the book. You know, he's posting stuff about me in the conversation, and I'm doing that about him. It was just such a good symbiotic relationship that I was so impressed with him, and I still am to this day. And I look forward to hanging out with him in his town with his friends and having a cigar with him. Maybe I don't even smoke cigars, but maybe I'll try one with him. Dean Hall is another great conversation, and Dean was special. So Dean has a motto of living life to the fullest, and he does it with a lot of cold therapy and cold plunges. The guy swam through the Willamette River, ice cold temperatures, while he was battling cancer. But the takeaway wasn't that he was beating cancer with cold therapy or doing grounding or doing all these things. It was a great reinforcement to me because I believe in a lot of those things. And I really do love watching people execute in those areas of just natural healing. But it was also just a really great reminder to me personally that something like cancer shouldn't define you. He didn't let it define him. He defined what he was going to do. He controlled the controllable. It was almost like talking to Jim Valvano from ESPN when he did that beautiful speech pre-passing away. And I got the same vibe from Dean. And Dean's another lifelong friend. He's one of those guys that, I posted a video and I talked about a little bit of a vulnerable subject about how tough it was to drop my son off and how challenging it is to sometimes go through that empty nesting phase. And I was sharing some stories and I got a private DM from him. Hey man, I spent a lot of years in therapy. If there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here for you. I will do anything. And my therapy is getting it out to the world and kind of walking through it and talking through it. But Dean's one of those guys that truly lives life to the fullest, and I love following him. He's someone that I love supporting. I love following on social media, and I've really loved the lifelong connection. In talking with Dr. Taryn Marie, another awesome guest, she is a resilience expert. And when you're talking to someone about resilience, the conversations can be the same. Everybody goes through some challenges, and they come out on the other end, and they tell their story, but she was unique. She was different. And what I really learned from that conversation was something I learned in the podcast and how I could be better every single day at having these conversations. She was very authentic and very vulnerable in that conversation. And I continued to ask deeper questions, something that I might have skirted on before and I might have stayed away from. But the depth of the questions and the connection that we had on the Zoom and her ability to share such a major challenge in her life, relationship challenges, true resilience was not only talked about, but shown. And a lot of it came from the depth of our conversation. Her emotional vulnerability on the show, to me, was very touching. And it's such a great outlet for us to share stories, for us to learn from each other, but most importantly, to impact other people. Because that story, that struggle, can really help to make other people hear what's going on, see it, feel it, and then experiment with how that might happen in their life or how resilience could help them in their situation. So another great conversation, another great guest. I love having health conversations, and Kristen Kirkpatrick and Dr. Ibrahim were unbelievable to learn about the fatty liver. And what I found really special about this one is how important health is to life. Health is wealth. And they talked about this and they gave so many facts and figures. 1 in 4 people have fatty liver issues. And this is the kind of thing that you don't know is affecting so many people around you. But in doing this show, I've had a multitude of people come up to me and say, hey, I have an issue with that. That was a great show. I had a neighbor and a friend of mine who I got to interview and talk to ahead of time because I knew that this was something that he was struggling with and he wanted to understand a little bit more. And he sent me some questions to ask. It was a great show for so many reasons. It was learning. It was advocating. And ultimately, it was also a way to connect the people that I know, like, and trust in my life and understand some ways to help them. And that conversation, I think, is going to help a lot of people. And they are doing great work. They were great guests. They were great and a wealth of knowledge in so many ways. I'm just grateful to have had that conversation. When I started this podcast, I made a list of some top 10 guests that I would love to have. And Dr. Stephen Gundry was one of them. He just so happened to have a new book coming out called Gut Check. I got on the list to have him on the podcast, and I was super excited. So excited because I actually have used so much of his research and the knowledge I've attained from the books that I've read. Years and years ago, I started to leverage and utilize Dr. Gundry's research, and it was unique and different and something that's helped me personally. So to be able to interview him and have a conversation, and we didn't just talk about gut check. We didn't just talk about gut health. We actually got into how he uses these things in his life. One of my favorite parts is when we talk about going to Europe and why you can eat things there and why you can't eat the same things here. And understanding the why behind it really helps to just motivate people to make the right decisions both here and wherever they're at in their health journey. Dr. Gundry is leading a charge on helping to educate people, and having him on the show was not only an honor, but it was also a gift to me in this process. And I felt so honored and grateful to have him. It also opened up a lot of doors. Dr. Gundry was doing a lot of media, and from the Gundry interview, I had so many people reaching out to me to be on the show that we actually had to start turning people away. And it was consistently happening. And I was really grateful for the impact Dr. Gundry made, not only on the wish list coming through, but also on the impact he made to this show. When I did the conversation with Damon West, I don't think I have ever been more prepared for a conversation. As I read his original book, it was old and it was a little bit outdated, but it was such a great story. And to the point where he's like, "Oh man, you read the old book," when we got on the interview and the conversation. But here's what stood out to me. All the similarities to his upbringing, to his life, to the things he loved, to how he communicated with people. I really felt a connection from the beginning, just reading his story. And then I started to actually learn the story, and there were disconnections. Like, I didn't get addicted to drugs at an early age. I didn't blow up a college scholarship like he did. And he did all these things that were on the edge of failure, but he didn't quite fail until he failed huge. And he ended up getting a life sentence in prison for over 65 years for being one of the most renowned burglars in Dallas, Texas. And so, I remember telling my wife that I was going to interview this guy, and she's like, "Wait, he's a criminal." And the questions were valid questions, but I said, no, the story is so interesting. Here's what he's doing today. So Damon ends up getting out of prison, and I loved learning the story of how he went through that. But he found a higher power. He trusted in God. He got sober. But most importantly, in this interview, there were a couple of major takeaways. Number one, the human behind addiction is there. The original human, the person that you get along with, someone just like you and I. Maybe we haven't been addicted to that particular item, but maybe there's another addiction in our lives. And it's just a good reminder that the story of understanding someone is so valuable. The other one was, I mentioned that I have never been more prepared. Well, Damon has to check in at probation and parole just to travel, and he speaks all over the country. His coffee bean mantra about changing your environment is a phenomenal book and a phenomenal speech, but he does it with Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban and all the major college football programs across the country. But every time he leaves, he has to check in with probation and parole because that's going to be a part of his life forever. And he's grateful for it. But it also made him late to the podcast. And so what was super cool is he came on and he was going to just reschedule. He was super kind and humble and a great conversation to start. And I said, "Damon, I know your story's so good that I don't want to miss the opportunity to have this conversation right now. If you give me 45 minutes, this will be a great interview and a great conversation. And I will speed us up in the areas that I know we need to speed up in. I'll help you be as equipped as possible." And you know what? I was completely prepared. I read his whole book. I had listened to podcasts. His Ed Milet interview was a phenomenal podcast I actually listened to with my family. And it was one of the first times my kids were listening and were excited about the fact that I was going to interview a particular guest. He was a great conversation, somebody I truly enjoyed learning about. And his story was so interesting. You talk about resilience. It is the ultimate story. And he's a really, really impactful human being. It's always fun to do a interview and a conversation with somebody that you know, but you don't know well. And Evan Carmichael is someone that's in Genius Network with me. I've sat next to him. We've had meals together. And I have been around him, but I've never had the chance to ask him these types of questions. I've seen him in a presentation mode. I mean, he is an amazing YouTuber and somebody that I admire, somebody that we actually work with as well. So I know him, but I didn't get to know the story until you have someone on. And Evan is such a special guest because on the other side of difficult and scary and hard is usually the success that you're searching for. And he really talks about building momentum. And what does momentum start with? It starts with movement. And I don't care who you are. I personally have to be reminded of this all the time. When something seems insurmountable, it is scary, it is hard, it is difficult. You are fearful a little bit. You don't want to fail. But when you just move towards the target, towards the opportunity, Evan really hammers that home. And we talked about the podcast. We talked about expanding Scott Danner and the brand and some of the things that I was struggling with. And he was so good at just giving great advice and leading and understanding Evan's story, understanding how he built it from the ground up. He's just such an interesting human to talk to. And, I am a firm believer that so many people just stop right when they're so close to breaking through. And the breakthrough just starts with that movement, but you got to keep going. And Evan did a great job of reminding us that it's worth it to keep going because the breakthrough comes from that momentum. Judd Brewer was a super interesting interview and a conversation, and here's why. First of all, anytime you start off with somebody that has a love for something, he sees the Believe poster right behind me and says, "Oh, you love Ted Lasso." And we started the conversation with so much connectivity, so much, interest in each other and understanding what we loved about the show. And what was so interesting is we started to dissect characters. We started to go through this process, and it's what I did when I watched the show. I really wanted to understand certain characters and the dynamic of how they thought and where they came from. And he just further, pressed upon the exact points that I had been thinking and talking about. And together we started this really great relationship. So much so that when the show ended, I actually bought 2 Believe shirts and we decided we'd do a follow-up interview where we were talking about Ted Lasso and the psychology of the characters in Ted Lasso. So we have a second one scheduled at some point in time, but here's the takeaway. His look on life with optimism and positivity and all the things that actually Ted Lasso and that show encapsulate were the best part of that conversation. And this guy is well known for his helping people with addiction with food, addiction with cigarettes, addictions in general. And he's written amazing books to help people overcome that. But it starts with kind of defining what are the most important things. And he even does this little thing where, if you really think about something, you find how disgusting it could be, like smoking. Does it really taste good? And he goes through this process on the show, and it was so good that it just made me want to read and learn and have more and more of Dr. Judd. And I thought he was a phenomenal interview, a phenomenal guest, and certainly worth watching. And the fact that he loves Ted Lasso made me like him even more. Carrie's son was a phenomenal conversation, and here's what really stood out to me. We started out the conversation, and I said, "Listen, Carrie, I'm here. You have a new book that's coming out. I can't wait to talk about the book, but I really believe that people want to know you. And if they know you and they know your story, then they're interested in buying the book. But they don't usually just buy a book to learn the story unless they're aimlessly grabbing something that has a great cover or whatnot." And as we started talking, she was like, "You know what? It's so refreshing. I get onto so many podcasts and the conversations are all about selling the book. And that's what the publisher wants. That's what the PR team wants. You have to talk about the book." But Carrie's story was awesome. Her journey through private equity and the similarities of the finance world and our lives and the people she worked with and for were so intriguing and so interesting. But the way she came at life, she really defined herself by taking money out of the conversation. She actually walked away from an engagement with a very wealthy family just because it was more about the superficial stuff than it was about what she thought mattered most. And so because she helped define the things that mattered most, and she's living a life of values and principles, she really was leading a very interesting story. And so as we got into the story and we learned those values and we learned those principles, I can tell you it makes everybody want to buy her book. Super fun, super interesting, and Carrie was just so much fun to have on the show. When I started the conversation with Dr. Neha, she was in this super swanky, cool New York hotel room that looked like a set. it was so neat that I had to comment, on the color palette, how she matched perfectly. And she was like, oh, you noticed I actually matched my outfit to match this. And we had this, again, great connection to start the conversation. But she really dove deep on trauma and the trauma that comes with people pleasing. And I certainly resonated with that. I think a lot of people do. I definitely have I don't give a shit mentality to most things in life. But when it comes to helping the people I love the most, I will do anything, sometimes way too much. And listening to her really resonated both with me and I know a lot of our listeners because of the fact that Dr. Neha talks about the trap of people pleasing and that it never ends and that she fell into it and she was there. She didn't even know what she wanted to be when she grew up because she was too focused and worried about defining it based on what other people thought. And mainly her family and her culture and the things that were really, really important. So that conversation was one that not only did it start off with a super cool vibe and her education, her background, her studies, everything that she's putting out into the world is worth following and looking at. But most importantly, it's important to remember that people pleasing is a trap. And if I just took one thing away, that was worth remembering forever. Dr. Sue Varma came on the show. And again, another one of those radiant guests. You just feel the positive energy immediately. And her book, Practical Optimism, is everywhere. She was on the Today Show, Good Morning America, you name it. She's been on everything. And knowing that she was doing all that while she was also doing our show was such an honor. And I was grateful to have her on the show. But most importantly, the takeaways. The conversation went to purpose. And it went to her letting other people kind of define her path and whether or not she was going to follow her mother or her father's path. And actually, she ended up following both. And it was super interesting. But your purpose needs to be defined by you. And her book, Practical Optimism, is really a great way and great lessons to stay optimistic in your life. But it's a lot easier to do so when you're charting your own course. Purpose is something that is not someone else's place to define for you. Purpose is something that you must define for yourself. And when you find it, passion follows. And she obviously was passionate about what she's doing. And she, again, radiates that energy and she's making a difference. There are real practical execution points in that book. You can actually do things that she says and it will make your life better. And listening to that and then redefining purpose and making sure that your purpose is not for somebody else, but for you was really key. She also talked a lot about growth. And if you're not growing, you're dying. Lou Holtz said that. I say it all the time. She said, if you're not growing, you're dead. That it's the same thing. You're empty. Growth is a natural progression, and you want to continue to grow. And purpose comes from learning. Purpose comes from growth. Purpose comes from exploration and failure. And passion follows that. And so talking with Dr. Sue and really learning from her was a great conversation. I look forward to having another one with her in the future. And everybody should listen to that because that is something that's extremely important. Find your purpose and keep growing, and you'll find a ton of passion all through the rest of your life. These are only a handful of guests. And these are guests that stood out to me, but I don't have a favorite. In fact, I get charged up to do this conversation every single week we're doing it. We've had, like I said in the beginning, over 50 conversations, and every one of them has energized me. I don't ever think of this as a job. I think of this as something that I love doing and I love learning. And each one of these conversations is creating more opportunities, more conversations, more connections, more ways to work with people that are like-minded. When you listen to these conversations are all about what's important at the time, what's important to me, what my takeaways have been from their book. It's not just an interview. It's really a chance for us to learn about each other and hopefully share that conversation with you, and the listener can take something away from that. I look forward to growing this show a whole lot further than we have right now. I'm very proud of our team, and I'm proud of everybody that's been a part of this to build it to this part. But we're only getting started. We're going to take that growth mindset. We're going to grow this thing even further, and these conversations are only going to get better. I am so excited to have shared with you the several people we talked about today. And if you haven't listened to the show, Start now because these are only a small handful of really amazing guests.